So the reason we created this Home Spirit tool was because we felt it would improve the quality of life for people. That's really been the driver. Ultimately, though, we did have to know how to develop it because it started off as one thing and has meandered into something bigger. So we needed to put it against something so that we knew it was a tool that was not just about ideology, but also effective around standards and expectation legally and legislation. Now, we started off by thinking, OK, let's look at some of the areas where perhaps this tool's going to work very well. And one of those areas is home care, although it's not only about home care. And ultimately, we looked at home care overview inspection. It's reasonably recent. It's 2013. And what we got from this inspection is that they used 38 providers in this sort of snapshot summary, and it was decided that 28 of those providers were failing in care planning. I don't like the word failing. I think it's about struggling, and I think all care planning has a struggle, actually. So ultimately, 28 are struggling in care planning. The problems that they noted is it care plans didn't have enough detail, didn't support people or staff to do a how-to. So the care plan would tell you about the person, but not necessarily how to respond. And our tool, absolutely, when you see it later, the person-centred planning tool is really driven by how-to in many ways. Also, it looked at the recorded documentation not necessarily being accessible, and sometimes with people who live in their own home, they get a carer coming in who they get used to, and then when that carer's on holiday or indeed leaves, they get another one and they feel they've got to say it all again. That's what the survey suggested, that people using services feel they're constantly reminding staff what it is they want and how they want it. So we've worked around a tool that hopefully is regularly and completely updatable in a very simple way. Also, looking at how you keep it current, up to date. Again, from this survey, it suggested that a huge number were out of date or from the original assessment, but 6 months later the person's changed in their ability or preferences, and it's not in their care plan. So we looked at those areas and thought these have got to be areas that we make the tool work, where we can make it work. Obviously, we're all keeping a close eye on the Care Act. The Care Act is the seminal piece of legislation that we're all having to work around. Ultimately, we wanted to look at the Care Act and think of the areas that we think we've specifically targeted in this tool. Now, obviously, one of the big areas is around prevention. This has been around this idea of prevention and delay into needing more care is a huge driver, and information and advice is a huge driver in all of our services. And we have an environmental tool that you'll see later, Caroline will show you, that specifically targets prevention and information and advice, particularly, but not only, but particularly around assistive technologies. And it's about how we can share that information with people with dementia in this circumstance, with their families, how they can get advice and how they can get it easily, and where they can get it from. Well, we think this tool is a platform where they can get all this advice. Personalisation agenda is nothing new to us. It's been around a long time. We recognise that many people using services now are doing it through direct payment. They're not necessarily having an agency come in. And in fact, they might employ individuals as PAs, personal assistants. And employing personal assistants, we wanted also this tool to reach to those people who are employing people directly. So this tool can work in we believe it's going to work in many different areas. Shared lives, a very good place for it to work in learning disabilities, home care, and the full tool, if it's used in its full capacity, we've checked against standards, fundamental standards. We believe it would work in residential care too. So we wanted it to be a one place to go where it could work in all platforms. Also, it's about harnessing the community. Now, we know that the Care Act, on the back of, big society really, that ultimately we need to be drawing in the community. So we have created a specific tool about community support, and it's called the Circle of Support. So again, the home care tool has directly created a part within it that responds directly to what the Care Act is expecting us all to do. So we feel we've really used this as our guide to respond to the pressures you're under if you are professional providers, the pressures you're under. Some of the other areas we felt were really important was to look at ASCOF. You're probably, if you work in this part of the industry, quite aware that ASCOF, the framework for outcomes, everything we do now is outcome focused. So you're measured against outcomes. That's the way all of us work now. This is the most up to date, up to 2016, and these are the areas that ASCOF have suggested need to be our outcome focus. The first one is quality of life. Well, I truly believe that the passion for this tool started because it starts as a tool that Caroline will talk about later, that really was the beginning on all this, called Still My Life. And that part of the tool is and will continue to be all the way through, however big, if it gets very big, it will always be a free tool to people who have been given a diagnosis of dementia. So we want it to be something that improves quality of life. Now, around the intervention around timely, they've used the term early diagnosis in ASCOF, but actually the terminology that they should be using is timely diagnosis. So early diagnosis isn't necessarily what everyone's striving for. If you have a learning disability, for instance, it might be very timely to support that diagnosis through the process in a very slow way. So I don't like the term early diagnosis. It needs to be timely diagnosis. But certainly our tool is thinking about how we support people at the very beginning. And for anyone here who's had a diagnosis of any kind, not just dementia, and certainly I have, when you're given a diagnosis, you go home on your own. That's what it feels like. And you go home on your own and you wonder what you do next. You kind of wait for letters. That's what you do. Whereas what we hope we've done is we've created a tool that somebody who's been given their diagnosis can go home with, certainly because this tool at the moment is focusing on dementia. So that somebody has a diagnosis of dementia in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, wherever, they've got something that they can go home with and start doing. That's what we really hope this tool will achieve. Ensuring that people have a positive experience. Well, I'd be really worried if our tool wasn't a positive experience, but in many ways, that's where your feedback will come back vitally important. And then it's around safeguarding. We all know safeguarding is how we support services right across, we support clients right across all services. And it's about avoiding avoidable harm or thinking about avoidable harm. This doesn't mean not positively risk-taking, but recognising that people may have harm in their way that they don't expect is going to harm them. Now, our environmental tool is targeting directly ways that somebody, particularly early on in their dementia, can think about how to plan for things that may cause harm to them later. And again, this is our linked to assistive technologies. So our tool is directly responding to safeguarding in that way. We thought we'd better remember that we've got the NHS to think about too, and eventually our tool will be more integrated with the NHS. That's our plan for it. And the NHS framework for outcomes is pretty much the same. You wouldn't expect it to be too different. Obviously, the big driver is to prevent people from dying prematurely, arguably to prevent people going in hospital at all. And we all know the cuts in social care is really the main crush on our NHS. This talk from the government about protecting our NHS is almost pointless as long as they continue to cut social support. Social care is what is going to protect our NHS, ultimately. And we feel that our tool can work very early to support people to remain as independent as possible for longer. Quality of life, already talked about it, the recovery model, and this is how people harness their skills, work from strength-based approach. Positive care experience, well, wouldn't that be lovely if everybody had a positive care experience? And again, it goes back to safeguarding. It specifically talks about safe environment from the NHS. So we've created one part of our tool is purely an environmental tool, and we feel the environment speaks volumes to us, always. When you all came in here today and you found a seat, none of you come and sat up here. Not because no one told you not to, it's because the environment told you not to. You know, it's the environment that speaks to us loud and clear all the time. Ultimately, the environment is very powerful. So our environmental tool, we hope to become a very powerful tool. And it can be part of the Home Spirit tool alone. It can stand alone. Okay, obviously we're going to have to think about cost. Now, we've just looked at home care here because it's one area where we think the tool works very well. It's certainly not the only area we expect it to work. But the UK HCA, and those of you that work in home care will be familiar with this site, basically talked very clearly, and you probably can't see it very much from there and you don't need to, but we all know the outcome of this little graph is there's going to be more older people, particularly, who need care. The explosion is growing, and Caroline will talk to you very much about those statistics in dementia, but ultimately it's a grower, an ageing population. We live longer, but do we live weller? And that's a very big question. We don't necessarily live weller, but we certainly live longer. Ultimately, we need to think about the explosion in numbers is expected, but the government is very clearly saying, but they're not releasing more money for it. So we've got to do more for less. You know, there's going to be more people expected more staff, expected for more clients, and yet the sort of, if we're looking at governmental budgets involved in that, they're not looking at double, tripling and quadrupling that. So this is going to be a tough area, and it's been a tough area for the last at least 5 or 6 years, I'm sure you're all aware. So we're trying to think of how this tool isn't going to cost you. Now, if you're a professional provider, there has to be a cost, but it's going to always and continue to be free for the person with dementia. And that's a part of the tool we'll talk about later. But if you're a professional provider, it is going to cost. We had to make sure it was going to make a saving in what the home care agency have decided is the cost of home care, and they've looked at the biggest cost, and you know it, it's staff. Basically, it's time. Time is the biggest cost. Staff is your biggest cost, and running the business. So you've got over 11 quid and then just 4.25 quid to run the business. So we had to think of a tool that was going to be able to come out of this very tight budget of just under 16 quid. Okay, we had to see. So we had to look at what is included in these costs. And one of the things that is included and expected is that staff are trained. And yet we also found some data that very clearly suggested that, in fact, huge numbers of people who work in dementia do not have specialist dementia training. So we wanted to create a tool that had an added value for training, and we believe, and it will come clearer later, that we've created part of the tool that's going to support competence and skills building on the job. Not always. Some people need to go away on training. I mean, obviously, I'm a trainer. I'd like to think that sometimes they're going to arrive. But generally, that can't be the only way we arrive. We improve competence. So we tried to create a tool that was going to improve competence whilst people were working. We responded very closely to that. So that's one area where we feel we can make a saving. Also, the time in running the business is for assessors to go out and do assessments of clients and then go back and pump it into a computer and then print it off. We've created a tool that can be done on the spot, also updated from its original rather than rewritten in a very, hopefully, very simple way. You'll get to see that later.
So Trisha's been talking to you about generic policy that's led up to the development of Home Spirit, and I'm going to talk to you about dementia and how we've been immersed in the subject and how through that process we've come up with the idea of Home Spirit. Now, I started my work with dementia as a very young social worker, and immediately I was thrown into the depths of dementia diagnosis, working in a mental health care of older people team. I sat around the table with occupational therapists, nurses, doctors, and even at that time, what struck me was the multi-perspective that was required to really get the measure of dementia, because it is such a complex subject. Fast forward 20 odd years and things have changed on some levels, but dementia is still a very complex subject. You know, it's still studied by neuroscience, geneticists, psychologists, sociologists. And with that, what has changed is that there's a much more of an integration between the topics, between the research. There's a lot more cross-cutting themes between psychology and health, for example. And to put this in context, for somebody with dementia who has purpose, hope and control in their lives, is more likely to use their brain more, is more likely to have relationships, is more likely to be mobile, is less likely to have ill health, and is less likely to have a hospital admission. And it all starts with purpose, hope and control. So how do we then reach people from a very early point, at the right point, and work with them in a very specific way? And that really has been our driving force. When I reach the age of 70, there'll be 1 in 3 people in this country over the age of 65. I mean, those figures are phenomenal. Age UK say that by that time, 1 in 5 will live to over 100. You know, that isn't that far away. But what that's meant is that it's created problems for the government around how we manage dementia on an economic level. And one of the strategies that they're adopting is around risk reduction. Embodied in what is known as the Blackfriars consensus is looking at how do we, throughout somebody's life, mediate those risks. We now know that conditions like heart disease, diabetes, depression, we all know that they're linked in some way to the development of dementia. We also know that from very early on in somebody's life, trauma, poor schooling, even when you're in the mother's womb and you're not getting the right amount of nutrition to your brain, all of that impacts potentially on developing dementia. In fact, Trish and I met somebody quite recently, diagnosed age 55, who in her early life had a lot of childhood trauma. Her mother was physically abusive to her, and what was proposed to her is that actually that might be a potential fact in her diagnosis. So one of the other things that is key in policy is about research, and in the Dementia 2020 there's been an upsurge in research, a commitment to doubling the amount of money spent on research, and also a commitment potentially to having open access. And that's really important. It's really important that people get access to the research, because the research now is coming at such a pace. It's bringing with it new opportunities like what we've seen hopefully in Home Spirit. Timely diagnosis, really important, not only from the perspective of people making decisions, but if you get people early enough, what happens is people have the cognitive power to sense make, potentially to develop coping strategies. Post-diagnostic support, also really key in terms of getting the support at the right time for people. And we know that MDAS work very, very hard in Hertfordshire to make sure that people get the support that they need in a very structured way. But what happens next? What happens after that kind of support? Hopefully what the Home Spirit tool offers some kind of consistency or follow-up. As Trish has already said, that there is also in policy this expectation that people with more complex needs are supported in the home environment. But how is that possible? Dementia costs our economy £23 billion per year. 10 billion of that is spent in care costs and a staggering 11 billion on informal support. What if we had developed a tool that can support both informal support through family carers or carers? I'm reminded recently not all carers are family carers, and also support services. The other key area is around training, and this is something, you know, a lot of these were on the initial strategy in 2009. And since then, as training providers, we have been immersed in the subject of dementia at a very, very exciting time where the research is coming very, very quickly. So we know Tier 1 and Tier 2 is available around the health service. In terms of communities, it's Dementia Friends. And in terms of social care services, it's been us, 3 Spirit, providing a lot of the training over the last 8 years. And what I'm going to talk to you very briefly is about the kinds of things that we've been working with and how this has sort of led up to the development of Home Spirit. So one of our development areas is positive interventions, and how can we work positively with people with dementia? And the kinds of subjects that we were looking at in our research is art, music, and obviously cognitive stimulation therapy known as CST. CST now is offered more widely in day services as well as memory clinics, and essentially it's exercising the brain in a very structured way, introduced into the NICE guidelines in 2006. So what we're saying in our tool is, how do we enable people to exercise their brains? You know, how can we encourage people to really get out there and understand the importance of building cognitive reserve? And we've had offshoots of that now. There's something called COGS, developed by a brilliant woman called Jackie Tuppen, which is a sort of day service type model of CST. We definitely need more of those in Hertfordshire. The other area that we've been working in is nutrition. So we've been working very closely on the nutrition pathways here in Hertfordshire. We've obviously got a very close interest in dementia and nutrition. We know that people that are obese, we know that people that are obese have
that was not cued in. Yeah, just so you know that. Yeah, people that are obese, I'll sit down. Thank you, Caroline.
We know that people that are obese are at higher risk of developing dementia, but the inverse is true in later life. So if somebody's over the age of 65 or in their 70s, research suggests that actually being overweight is a protective factor. Now, scientists don't really know why that is, but what's interesting is that there is a complex, unknown relationship between nutrition and dementia. In the work that we're doing, we know that lots of people with dementia struggle to eat, and there are lots of reasons for that. It could be that they have difficulty navigating the environment, difficulty understanding what's in front of them, their taste changes, they prefer sweet things, their sense of smell changes, they have problems potentially eating a balanced diet. And inevitably, a lot of that leads to ill health. So what we're saying within our tool is think about nutrition. Think about nutrition in terms of the brain. Think about very early on what nutrients we need for optimal brain functioning. Now, the evidence base in this area is pretty weak, but there is some exciting research going on where they're developing potentially what they call medical foods to support optimal brain functioning. Another area that we're working on or have been working on is sleep. Now, we all know that sleep is restorative to the brain. We know that we function better after a long sleep. So for somebody with dementia, it's even more important, but somebody with dementia might struggle, as you know, with sleep problems. What we know from research, and for any of you that watched telly recently, is that actually sleep potentially is important in making sure that we don't get dementia, because what happens when we sleep potentially, and this is research on mice, so we have to take it with a pinch of salt, is that it basically cleans the brain while we sleep, potentially cleaning beta amyloids from the brain, which has been implicated in Alzheimer's. So what we're saying as part of our tool is think about how you're going to sleep. It's the basic things. It's actually really important. You know, if somebody's got dementia, it's even more important to sleep. Now, we work with a lot of people in our development that have dementia. We talk to them a lot about our material. People with dementia tell us that they are physically exhausted by the end of the day, that mental and physical exhaustion, just by having to cope with some of those cognitive challenges. People also explain to us that sometimes they don't know the difference between dream and reality, and that can be very frightening. So there are lots of difficulties around sleep. So looking at how do we support people with sleep. Another emerging area is exercise. And just to give you a couple of key facts about exercise, a Danish study found that actually exercise didn't help with cognitive function, but it did help us around dealing with some of our anxiety, depression, and any of us that are into exercise know that exercise can impact on our mood. So that's got to be a good thing. Another American study showed that exercise was implicated in the production of tau, which again has been linked to Alzheimer's. And in a Canadian study, they showed that exercise actually improved brain function. So we're saying to people very early on, how are you going to embed exercise into your day-to-day? Now, we've been delivering environment training for a long time in Hertfordshire. We had to fight to get it on the programme, but we think it's really, really important. And we developed through this work principles, and you might see them on your tables. And we've called our principles flowers, and it stands for F for familiarity. So if you're in a care home or a hospital, it's important from the perspective there has to be something in the environment to remind the person of who they are. L stands for legibility, and that's being able to see and recognise the objects around you. And because if somebody has visual perceptual problems, they might, for example, have difficulty seeing that water in that clear glass. And potentially if we use juice, somebody might be able to see it. So thinking about that. Orientation, how can we orientate somebody that it's daytime? What assistive technologies can we use? W for wayfinding. E for an enablement, and this is where we've broadened from the King's Fund principles, where we're looking at assistive technologies and some very exciting technologies. One I discovered only yesterday, where it's a chip that goes into a pad, and then it does urine tests, to see if anybody's got an infection. So really interesting types of assistive technology, and of course safety. Another area that we've been working with is the links between loneliness and health generally. Some research seems to suggest that loneliness is as harmful as 15 cigarettes a day. We know that loneliness potentially impacts on our cognitive performance, on our blood pressure. It can lead to depression. Depression can then lead to dementia. So what we've introduced is what we call a circle of support. And finally, because we're working a lot with people on the later stages of their journey, we're looking at how can we support and promote identity. And identity is very closely linked to self-esteem. And if any of you have watched Panorama recently, there's a gentleman who I have had the pleasure to meet who says, the person that I miss the most is me. You know, this is a gentleman living with dementia. So how can we help people to capture what's important to them early on? As training providers, the environment that we're working in as a training provider is very different now to it was about 10 years ago. For one, there's been massive cuts across services, so we can't release staff to actually attend training. So we have to think of other ways of educating staff. That's one of the key changes. Another change is that we're working more through social media. A lot of people are on their mobile platform. Besides destroying families, it's also actually people are also learning much more through these platforms. So as an organisation, we've been thinking about how can we get our message across, and so came the idea of the infographics. And when we produce these infographics, an enormous amount of work goes into them. First of all, we will review the evidence base, and that takes a long time. Then we will put our practice hat on and think, what are the issues in practice? What is happening out there that needs to be challenged, talked about, corrected? We will also never ever, apart from in one infographic, use pictures of real people, because one, we don't know if they've given permission, and two, we don't want to perpetuate negative stereotypes of what old and dementia is. So our infographics kind of go through that process. We also need to think about who's going to see these. Are these for families, care workers, health workers? What language do we need to use? What language do we need to challenge? And we started doing this about 3 years ago. We started to develop our infographics and we started sharing them. And the more we shared them, the more people liked them, the more we developed them. And just to give you an idea of our impact with these infographics, over Dementia Awareness Week, 100,000 people around the world saw our infographics. Not bad for a bunch of girls that work from home, sharing our resources freely. And really, this is because they're freely accessible. What happens that we start the debate, because then people say, well, what about this? Or what about this? Or have you thought about this? And exciting opportunities for collaboration develop from actually sharing your resources freely. So you can't see them very clearly, and I apologise for that. But Trish, do you want to do a very brief about this particular infographic?
Do you see she put the emphasis on the word brief. Okay, yes, this infographic is something that came off very easily for me. We do spend a lot of time creating these infographics, and frankly, I could do 3 of these. It's about words, really. It's very simple. I'm a true and firm believer that what we say affects what we think, and what we think affects what we do. So, for example, when we ask somebody to feed someone, I think that's immediately presuming that the person needs more support than they might need. And I think that the worker's not to blame here. If you say, can you go and feed Michael? Then the person's going to go over, pick up the spoon and start putting food into Michael's mouth. But actually, Michael might just need support to cut his food up or the plate turned round, actually. And what we need to say is, can you support Michael to eat? So I have a really strong opinion about words, and I've been fighting the first one on this for a long time, I think, and particularly challenging behaviour. Challenging behaviour is a term we use in care or in schools. It's crept in, and certainly in kennels for dogs, but we don't use it about ordinary life. If I go to the pub and have a row with someone, they don't say as I'm leaving, that woman's got right challenging behaviour. No, they might just say you're leery, or you're angry, or you're a pain in the neck, or you're frustrated, or you're drunk, whatever it might be. But they're not going to say you've got challenging behaviour unless you go into care. And in fact, I would argue that I would have that label fairly quickly, as many of us would. So these are the words that I wanted particularly to put on this list, and there are others. And you'll see the infographic. You'll have a chance to see it a bit later.
Thank you. That was brief.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm learning brief.
So I'm just showing you a few of what the subjects we've tackled and who we've tackled them with over the last few years. So another really, really big issue is dehydration. And, you know, even in this day and age, people are still dying of dehydration, you know. And for an older person, it brings all kinds of other risks with it. So this dehydration resource has created a lot of discussion and debate. And a recent Cochrane review shows that actually, you know, checking someone's urine and seeing if somebody's got a dry mouth isn't a sufficient indicator. And actually, we should be monitoring the amount of fluids we're giving people. One of the things I will say about training is that people may not remember training after the training, you know, so we've got to find ways of keeping information alive in people's minds. So the infographics are important in embedding learning. I mean, if I asked all of you here, recall exactly everything from a training session you've done recently, actually you would struggle to. Unless you're using it day to day, you would struggle to. So what the infographics do is they remind you at the points of practice what's important. Imagine you've gone to a first aid training and you've forgotten what to do if somebody chokes and someone's choking in front of you, and then potentially you've got an infographic here at the point of practice. You might not think about it in the panic, but at least you've got the resources there. Mind Echoes, another really important resource, because people with dementia experience all kinds of confusion, and sometimes it's wrongly attributed to the dementia. And Mind Echoes was produced, if I'm allowed to say this, Helen, after a few glasses of wine and a late night Twitter chat. And it was a collaboration, and actually it worked out really well. And it's a really good tool for people to use and to think about the other things that cause confusion. And what this includes is social as well as medical, whereas the other tools is looking very specifically at delirium, this is looking at other things around social things. As I said, we've had opportunities to collaborate, and this tool was created by the LEAD Coalition, which are the most powerful force around dementia in the States. They're a very powerful network of organisation that wanted to work with us around stigma, because stigma is in access to services, stigma is in our relationship building, stigma is everywhere around dementia. So how do we tackle it and challenge the topic? And so we developed a resource. And this one, which is straight off the print, it was only used yesterday at a conference because it's Delirium Week this week, developed in conjunction with a doctor that's championing delirium. And it's a very important message that delirium is preventable, you know, and these resources are really important in making sure that that learning is continuing at the points when it's really, really critical.
Okay. So we're going to move on now, and we're just coming into the tool, but I wanted us to talk about, if you like, the NICE guidelines 2015, particularly around home care. Like I say, this tool should and can work across the board, but we're focusing in particular around home care because we feel this is where it'll work maybe easiest, or quickly. It might be uptake in that place first. Recognising that we wanted to use the NICE guidelines around home care, we wanted to create the tool that directly responded to that. So we know that it should be goals and aspiration-led, and aspirational-led is what we're very interested in. Person-centred planning is all about dreams and goals. Also focusing on what people can do. Now there's a problem with our tool, one small problem, we couldn't change it. One part of it starts with need rather than strengths, and we will be changing that around, so we didn't get a chance before the hard launch today. But starting with what somebody can do, that's all good and well, but the truth is nobody gets funding for things they can do. They get funding for things they can't do. So from the very beginning, it starts off very much as a needs-led approach. We want this tool to be much more about what people can do and building upon that. Recognising, very importantly, that again in the NICE guidelines, there's an expectation that we get information out there, not just information about care, but information outside of care, such as assistive technologies. But I do want to make a point about assistive technology. They're fantastic and innovative, and we were at the Alzheimer's show on Friday, and you can pick up and touch things that are brilliant, yeah, that work, but they're expensive. You know, assistive technologies for the middle and upper classes, it's not for the working classes right now. But I guess the reality is that the more they're made and the more they're bought, the cheaper they become. At the moment, people living in poverty or close to poverty are not going to spend money on the assistive technology. And in fact, they're probably quite isolated because they may not even have a laptop or a computer or access to a computer. So we know assistive technologies are not going to go to everyone, but we do believe that the more people use assistive technology, the bigger production, the cheaper they get. A bit like our phones. You know, one day everyone can afford a phone, and we're almost there. Things become cheaper the more they're used. So we believe in assistive technology being a really positive thing, and one of our tools directly supports assistive technology. We also know that there's an expectation that people have a written summary of any planning they have. So our tool creates a written summary, which you'll see later, that people feel safe and they have peace of mind. Well, I'd like to think that this tool supports peace of mind because it's pretty holistic, but it's also controlled by the person, we hope. We'll talk about that in detail later. That we recognise that people have to and will continue to take risk. And in fact, positive risk-taking is a really important part of this drive, is that because we provide someone with care, it doesn't mean we should know everything about their life. In fact, they might not want you to know everything about their life, and that might involve some risk. And we recognise that, and that will become more clear later. We also looked at the understanding that people need to have access to anything that's written about them. My memory of accessible formats in my career has been that whilst we talk about accessible formats, when you create an accessible format, people don't like it. It's not very smart, it's not very easy to read. And one example I'm going to give is I worked with a guy with learning disabilities it was very important to him to be involved in his incidents, and he had lots of incidences. He was a very angry and quite justifiably angry young man with learning disabilities. So when an incident report was written about him, I managed that service, I always said the staff had to make sure that he wrote an incident report too, and all he could write was swear words and his old address. So he would write that every single time, and back in those days we had to fax. Before the days of email, we used to fax it to the social services, local authority, as was a requirement. And of course the local authority complained to me bitterly because what I would fax was his and then the staff's copy. And they said this was entirely inappropriate to be coming through the local authority fax machine. And I just said, are we saying that the man with learning disabilities expressing his feelings in an incident is entirely inappropriate? And that was the sort of beginning of my fight and war with legislation and with regulation and with culture of care, actually, that in fact accessible formats are very difficult to achieve because the powers that be don't want them accessible. They want them in a smart outcome way that we can all read and it's all simple. But for getting people in control of their lives, they have to produce care plans that they're in control of, and so they have to be able to understand it. So we talk about it in nice outcomes, but whether it really happens, I don't see much of it, to be honest. So what can we do to meet all these nice outcomes? And this is the moment where I wanted everyone to scream out, Home Spirit tool, but I'm not sure that emotionally I've got you there yet on that one. And I don't expect you to assume that it's the answer to all of these expectations. But Caroline and I really believe it could be. And what's important is that you have an opportunity to see it. And we're quickly going to go through the platform just here. You're going to see the platform in a second, but it covers certain areas. One is the circle of support, and it's a relationships tool, meeting all the expectation around community support. Those of you that have used circles of support in the past will recognise that we're supported by many things, not just people. And actually circles of support shouldn't just be about people. We could be supported by our library or supported by the pub. Actually, a pint of beer could be part of our circle of support. It doesn't have to be humans, it could be a dog, you know. Ultimately, the circle of support needs to be a dynamic tool, so we hope we've created one. We also hope we've created one that's very movable and very easy to use, and we're going to show you that in a moment. But also a tool that hopefully for some people moves the professional support from being their only support toward the outside and actually brings in the community. That's the idea. That I've worked with people whose their whole circle of support in the past has been paid. You know, the tragedy of that life, where everything and anything that supports them is someone who's paid. And what we need to do is start looking at that and think, well, there's something really wrong here if somebody out there has only paid support in their life. And maybe that's a good way for us to sort of plan to support them in other ways. It involves risk-taking, circles of support. It does involve risk-taking. You know, we start getting into regulations. If somebody arranges for someone from the Gurdwara to pick them up to take them to their place of worship, or indeed on a Friday they want to go to the mosque, they might say to us, I've got someone picking me up from the mosque, they take me there. Now, it might be easy for us to say that's great, but then we start thinking, are they CRB checked? You know, have we got sort of all the right regulation in place? And that stops people being in control. And is it any of our business if they've chosen somebody from the church or the mosque to support them to go there in the day? Is it any of our business? No, I don't think it is, actually. So we need to start knowing when to butt out as well, and I think the circle of support might help us to do that. There is an environmental tool. The environmental tool can stand alone. All of these tools can stand alone. And Caroline's going to go through the environmental tool with you. We hope that the environmental tool really grows, actually. And you can see when you look at it with Caroline, its potential, I believe. The person-centred planning tool is a big part of this tool. Person-centred planning can come from lots of directions, but for somebody I've always believed it has to come from aspiration and dream, but it has to come from the person being in control. For those of you that have done PCP training, you might have used a tool before about important 4 and important 2. It should always start with important 2 and important 4 for a start. What's important for me is to lose 3 stone and stop smoking. I know that's important for me. What's important to me is roll-ups and magnums. You can see the conflict, yeah? There's a direct conflict. Now, if you were going to knock up a care plan for me, I'd want you to first start with the fact that I want to smoke roll-ups and I want to eat magnums. And from there, I want you to plan what's important for me. And that might be to think about other things I might eat, or how often I smoke, or perhaps that's something I can do to combat the effects of smoke. It can only become important to me when I care about it. I've got to lose 3 stone at the very least. I can tell you now, I'm not interested in losing 3 stone for the sake of losing weight. But if you told me I was going on holiday to Paris with Leonard Cohen and Bob Dylan, I'd lose 3 stone by the weekend. And I would. And it's to do with wanting to do the outcome. The outcome is what's going to drive any of us. And a lot of our person-centred planning, I think, starts from the wrong position. It needs to start from what does the person really want in their life, what's important to them. And in that, we have to fit care, risk, support, and what's important for them. But it should never be the driver what's important for them. It's always got to be what's important to them. So you'll see by the time we get to the tool that we've started from that position.